Welcome to the Essential Instructional Practices in Literacy workshops. We have a series of video PowerPoint slides for you to watch as you explore the 10 essential instructional practices. This video is the first video and will explore the introduction and essential practice 1. These essential instructional practices are for every child in every classroom every day, right across the day. Literacy doesn't just happen in the morning at 9 o'clock. We might be explicitly teaching it then, but children are being literate in all learning areas right throughout the day. We've wrapped this professional learning around the spiral of inquiry by Helen Timperley. Your leaders will be familiar with this inquiry, and you might like to talk to them further about how this will influence the work that you do as you explore the impact and the significance of the essential instructional practices in your classroom practice. The key ideas are that you will notice, the student learning. So scanning and focusing is about finding out where learners are in their learning and thinking about which is the area that you need to learn more about in order to improve that student learning need that you've identified in your students. The developing a hunch is thinking about how we might be contributing to that problem. And one of the ways we contribute to the problem that we've identified of student learning need is perhaps in our area of knowledge. As new educators or experienced educators even, we find that there are areas of learning or areas of literacy development that we maybe don't know enough about. These essential instructional practices will give you an audit, will help you to see what is actually research-based and important that we actually be able to teach every day in our classrooms. So by going through these 10 instructional practices, you'll be able to identify some of your own learning needs. So when you learn to do things differently, you will expect to see some improvement in student learning outcomes. So that's why the learning part is circled on this spiral, because after you've participated in these 10 essential instructional practices, you'll be able to go away and take some action on considering how you might do some things differently, because you know they're important to do every day for every child in every classroom. The whole idea of the 10 essential instructional practices is built around the idea that literacy is about meaning making. We use reading, writing and talking in combination to make meaning. This diagram shows you how to make meaning, we need to be involved in lots of thinking. So always think to yourself every time you design a task for students to do, what sorts of meaning making are children making from this activity and how are they involved in thinking? They're great things to think about when you start to plan activities and think, well, are they just an activity that keeps students busy while I'm trying to take a small group, or do they really entail meaning making and thinking? At the end of 2019 in Alice Springs, a new education declaration was determined by our education ministers. And goal number 2 it says that all young Australians become confident and creative individuals, successful lifelong learners and active and informed members of the community. This is a goal across Australia. To do this, they mentioned the fact that we need to develop the ability and motivation to learn and play an active role in their own learning, and have essential skills in literacy and numeracy. Now, this is the essence and the basis of the 10 essential instructional practices. So while these practices the research has been done in America, it's actually at the forefront of what we need to be doing here in Australia to improve our student learning. It connects very nicely to the Australian curriculum, literacy progressions, and all of the elements and sub-elements that you can see here in the diagram. It's taken straight from the Australian curriculum literacy progressions. You'll see mentioned throughout the 10 essential instructional practices. So this is nothing new, but it is essential. So let's think about how understanding of these practices could improve our student learning, because research suggests that each of these 10 instructional practices outlined can have a positive impact on children's literacy development. You see here Professor Nell Duke. She was the lead researcher at the University of Michigan, who led the development of these essential practices. It was designed by GELM, the General Education Leadership Network in Michigan, involving professors at the university, principals, community organisations, as they worked together to determine what would be important for all teachers to teach. Now Duke talks about these essential instructional practices as so essential that if they were not happening in our classrooms on a daily basis, it could well be considered malpractice. These are not the only things you'll do in your classroom in the name of literacy every day, but what you will learn around these 10 essential instructional practices is exactly that, essential on a daily basis. These practices now span from birth through to year 12. They have birth to 3, for pre-kindergarten, which is our preschool, for K to 3, 4 to 5. We call it 4 to 6 because that's where our primary schools end, and then they have 7 to 10 essential practices as well. They're so generous with the research that they spent years determining that they feel it's so important that they've offered it free to every literacy educator in the world. Professor Nell Duke is someone that is highly regarded in the literacy world. She's a key researcher in this area and therefore a significant person to be working with. And this is why we have adopted this framework as something that is so important in the ACT. In your pack or in your Google Classroom right now, there are a series of resources. One of them is an audit tool. You'll see that if you go into the audit tool file, you'll find an audit tool for each year level. So you'll find a pre-K one, which is for preschool teachers, a K to 3, or a 4 to 6. You need to print or have access to the audit tool that is relevant to the year level in which you're working. What we'll be doing throughout the workshop is asking you at the end of each essential instructional practice to come back and look at the audit and determine your confidence level. Make some notes and decide whether you're really confident with this particular essential practice or whether there's an area that you think you might need to learn more about or look more closely at in your practice. By being diligent in your completion of the audit tool, by the end, it'll help you to determine where your next steps might be and perhaps where your action learning will be, because there's a particular aspect of these essential practices that you'd like to focus more on as an individual or with your team. So they're the resources you have. You'll also find in the Google Drive the essential instructional practices. They come in various forms, some that, as in we have the pre-K and the K to 3 and the 4 to 6 all in one document. So look for the essential practices whilst they're outlined in your audit. There is also another copy for those of you in P2 especially. The people who are listening to these workshops who are working in 4 to 6, you will find your essential instructional practices in the handout that is called Universal Day 10 Essential Instructional Practices, Years 3 to 6, Early Careers Teachers. And at the front of that, you'll have both K to 3 and 4 to 6 practices. Stop the video and find the resources that you're going to need as we go through. The next part of this video is about Instructional Practice 1. We'll begin with preschool. Preschool's Instructional Practice 1 is intentional use of literacy artefacts in dramatic play, both in the classroom and outside. So this is nothing new to you as preschool teachers, knowing the importance of play, and it's particularly dramatic play. But how intentional are you in providing the literacy artefacts that would perhaps be sitting in these play environments if they were in the real world? Think about a veterinary surgery. What sorts of literate practices do the people who participate in that particular workplace engage in? They have booking sheets, they have animals' names, they have folders that talk about what the animal, the history of the animal's medical area. They've got all sorts of maybe magazines in the waiting room. They've got a thermometer and perhaps some notes, a clipboard where a vet might take some notes when they're looking at the animal. Think about how you can place these particular literacy artefacts within the play area, working with the children and using their prior knowledge as well to help you determine what would be important. Because it's through the act of play that children will engage in being literate and practice those important skills as they grow into our literate society. So we as teachers need to provide models and use those models to encourage our children to engage with these appropriate literacy artefacts. For everyone else, it's essential practice 1 is deliberate efforts to foster motivation and engagement within and across lessons. You'll see under each of these essential instructional practices that there's between 3 and 5 dot points. Each dot point has its own research, or has research to support that this is a particularly important element for literacy learning. So while we can buy books on motivation and engagement, these practices summarise into 5. There are 5 key ideas under this big essential instructional practice 1 that will contribute, or research supports its contribution to motivation and engagement in literacy learning. So the first dot point we're going to talk about is that we need to provide opportunities for children to see themselves as successful readers and writers. Now, you could talk amongst yourselves and think about, well, what are you currently doing in your classrooms to help children build this identity as a reader and writer and their student agency? It's a very crucial part of our work. One of the things we do is build that reading and writing culture. We make the learning visible. So you can see on the screen here some anchor charts where teachers have talked about what do good readers do. So we're making visible what great readers do, and then every time we listen to a child in an interaction with reading, we're responding by saying, wow, did you hear what you just did? That's what great readers do. So we're building their identity as a reader through the conversations that we have. In kindergarten at the beginning of the year, at Lynham School, Vicky talks about how do I read a book? Helping children to even know that I'm going to pick up a book. I'll look at the front cover. I can flip through the pages. I can see if there's a word that I might know, or I might collect a familiar text. So making these ideas visible. In another resource that we have in the Google Classroom is videos and readings, a list, a Word document that has videos and readings for each of these 10 essential instructional practices that you might take some time later to look at and take your understanding deeper. We do have a video there of me creating an anchor chart about what we do when we read with young children. Now, my purpose for doing this was as a formative assessment, to find out what children already understood before I went to do a demonstration lesson. But your purpose is to do the same thing, to find out their prior knowledge and then to build on their understanding as you teach reading and writing. There are many other ways that you can develop their identities as readers and writers. These are just a couple to get you started. We need to, and another way, the same idea of identity of readers and writers, one of the things that's really important for you to consider is goal setting. Do your students know what it is they're trying to get better at every day as they go into reading and writing. Here are some ideas. In kindergarten, our reading goal is to choose books that we like to read. So at the beginning of the year, the children offer what they would like to do. Like, we look through the pages for things that we like. We open the book and we look for favourite pages. We look for the words we know. Now, these are children who are just beginning in their learning journey, who are being encouraged to see what it is that they're trying to do and to understand how they're getting smarter at reading on a daily basis. Think about, how do you develop goals with your class or your individual students? Do you ever ask your students, what did you learn about yourself as a reader or writer today that will help you in the days and weeks to come in your reading and writing? Because that's what we should be doing each day as we teach about reading and writing, is helping children to grow their understanding and feeling of success, that they are learning to be a successful reader and writer. This relates very much to feedback to student goals. So if you have set student goals, then when you're talking with them about their reading or their writing, make sure that the feedback you give them is related to the goal that they've actually set. And the more you make learning visible, or what it is, like what makes a great narrative, what's a great reader, what's a great paragraph, whatever your focus is, then that's going to help students to set purposeful goals, and then for you to give feedback that is related to those goals. Another important point that's related, that the Essential Practice 1 refers to, is that we need to establish purposes for children to read and write beyond being assigned or expected to do so. A challenge, really, because sometimes it's 10 o'clock in the morning, we say it's writing time, go and write. But who are they writing for, and why are they writing? So let's give that some thought. Nell Duke reminds us that it has been shown that the more authentic the work is, or the task that we ask our students to do, the more it resembles real-world enterprise, the more likely students are to be engaged and to achieve more. So authenticity is the key. Where does the writing happen in the real world that you ask children to do? We write lists, we label diagrams, we write notes, we write retells or recounts of what we've done. These things happen in the world, but do you tell the children that, and do we make them authentic experiences? Nell Duke has written a book on project-based learning. We know how important this inquiry learning and where children are operating under their own projects related to their interest. We know this is engaging. Research supports this. You might be interested to look at her book, Inside Information, which is about project-based learning in the early years. If we need to help children to write for enjoyment, for interest, to answer questions about the world, to address maybe community needs, or to communicate with a very specific audience. If you can provide opportunities for this to happen, we know engagement will increase. We need to provide daily opportunities for students to make choices in their reading and writing as well. How do you do that? Perhaps you could make some anchor charts. So on the left-hand side, there's one out of kindergarten again. How do I choose a book? So talk to the children about it, so they don't just go off to the reading corner and unintentionally choose a book. It just falls off the shelf. A nice anchor chart here is from a primary classroom of how to select a book. There's the intentional reader who goes about reading and reviews and asking people and having a purpose and all of the things the students have brainstormed here. And as the class has called it, an accidental reader who just randomly select a book or even fake read when it's reading time. Maybe individual book boxes are something that you've found successful. But what types of books are in those boxes? This relates very much to Essential Practice 8, which is all about a wide and rich selection of books or reading material. Make sure they don't just have those level text in those book boxes, but they're able to enjoy some great literature, some familiar texts, some predictable texts, some songs, some rhymes. Think about how you could include class-made books into these individual book boxes. We need to provide opportunities for students to collaborate with peers in reading and writing. Collaboration is key because we know that oral and written language are always learned in a social or cultural context. We learn to read, write and talk through our interactions with others. So why is literacy seen as a silent activity in some classrooms? We talk a lot about the idea of turn and talk because using turn and talk in your classroom means that every voice is heard and every child has an opportunity to have a thought, have a suggestion, not just the child with their hand up. Because after all, the person doing the talking is doing the thinking and the learning. And we want all children to be fully participating. You might like to have a look at the Turn and Talk video that is offered there. You'll see it in the file. It has the reading and video links. And look under Essential Practice 1. We need to generate excitement about reading and writing. Sometimes I go into classrooms and the children aren't really that excited about it, and you wonder why. That's because we as teachers need to bring in books, sell the books to the children, tell them how they're so fantastic and why this particular author might be one that's just right for this particular child. Steve Lane has written a book, Igniting the Passion in Reading, and he has some great ideas in there. One of them is hot reads, where you as a teacher put a book stand up in your classroom. I suggest every classroom has this in the school, and every teacher has a hot read where each week there's a new book that goes there that you tell the children why this is a book that just must be read. It'll be the hottest book in the classroom. And later, and especially in upper primary, children can take that responsibility of bringing a book and selling it to other children as why this book would be a great book for you to read. Series books are great as well, because once a child becomes familiar with a particular author or the characters in a book, then they do not have as much activating of prior knowledge to do before they start to read. And so helping children to get into a series is a useful thing. Also providing opportunities for children to talk about the books they've read and why others should read it and what was so powerful and important to them in that particular book is really worthwhile doing. You can have a look at the video, that's the link there in your video links around a teacher describing her reading culture and how she developed it in kindergarten. The important dot point in these essential practices is that we need to avoid attempting to incentivise reading through non-reading related prizes such as stickers. Bit of a challenge for us. But what sometimes happens is that we develop extrinsic motivation to read rather than intrinsic motivation. We want children to want to read because they know it's enjoyable, that they'll learn, and it is actually a very powerful thing to do. Sometimes we celebrate reading and it turns into a competition. The focus becomes counting and comparing versus loving reading. Linda Gambrell writes a lot about this and has written a book called No More Reading for Junk, which is very apt. We need to establish that rich reading environment where children want to read because there's so much of interest to read, and that they can talk to each other about it, and we can help them find that compelling book, that just right book. See Essential Practice 8 for even more information about those just right books. So we've taken a very quick look through the 5 very important aspects of motivation and engagement as Essential Practice 1. Because if you have children in your class who are talking about I can't or I won't, then we don't have the growth mindset that is necessary for success in reading and writing. So we need to start back at what is it we need to do to help these students see themselves as successful readers and writers. In your handouts, towards the back of your handout, you will find a page that has the 5 key elements or the 5 dot points of Essential Instructional Practice 1. I think it's on about page 17 for the primary people watching, page 10 for the early childhood people who are viewing this video. I'd like you to turn the video off and spend a moment actually talking with your peers or individually, thinking about what do you already do that would contribute to each of these 5 key elements of Essential Practice 1. What is working for you currently, and maybe what is something that you need to talk to someone else about to improve so that you can build a really rich reading and writing culture where every child sees themselves as a reader and writer and is motivated and engaged in the process rather than just being compliant because we said to do it. I encourage you to spend this time to make that documentation before you move on to view Essential Practice 2. After you've done that task, I would like you to get your audit tool out and find Essential Practice 1. Rate yourself on Essential Practice 1, your confidence of building this engagement and motivation within and across lessons, according to those 5 important dot points that we've just talked about. Give yourself a rating, make some notes, and then you'll be ready to move on to Essential Practice 2.